Okay, so here we go.
Have fun.
You too.
Welcome, everyone. Bienvenue. We're going to allow people to come into the room. If you want to turn on your camera and give a little wave. Hi, Bob. Hello, Joanne. Hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Just as a note, we're recording this session. It's already started. We might wait one more minute for people to join us, but we'll start fairly close to the starting point.
Hello, Angel.
Hey, Angel.
Hi, Angel. Nice to see you. I think we can start off, Jena.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. All right, everyone can see my screen nicely?
Yes.
All right. So welcome everyone who's just joined us to this introductory webinar on ecosystem approaches to health concepts and teaching resources. Margot and I are going to be presenting today, and Joanne St. Charles is with us to help with the technical aspects, and she'll be presenting the French webinar on Monday with me. So I'm very privileged to be able to be doing that today with my two colleagues. We thought we'd start out today by giving you a little bit of an idea, sharing with you why we keep engaging with the community of practice and ecosystem approaches to health. My name is Jena Webb, and I am just north of Montreal in unceded Indigenous territory that's been shared by many peoples over the course of the last few thousand years, and most recently lived on by the Kanekahaga, the Mohawk people, and currently lived on by the Mohawk people. And I've been thinking a lot this week, preparing this webinar with Margot about the legacies of colonialism that we live in as she deals with events unfolding close to her home with the Wet'suwet'en and the similarities of what happened with the Kanekahabaka people in Kanesatake during the Oko crisis. Kanesatake is the community where they put up a stand to protect the pines 31 years ago. It's about a 3-hour bike ride from my home. So I'm thinking a lot about that these days. Why I come back to and continue engaging with the Canadian community of practice in eco-health, there's two main reasons. One is the people who are also engaged in the community of practice. It really is a community of practice. So I was a young researcher when the first community of practice came into being in Latin America, and someone on my thesis committee, Donna Mergler, put me in touch with Joanne St. Charles and colleagues in Latin America. I was doing my research on contaminant levels in indigenous populations in the Ecuadorian and Peruvian Amazon. And we started working to build a community of practice there. And then a few years later, when the Canadian community of practice came into being, Joanne once again introduced me to Canadian colleagues, and they offered me a job to be coordinator when I was 9 months pregnant. So I started on maternity leave, and that really bode well for the relationship building that came to be over the last 14 years. And the other reason that I continue to work towards educating around ecosystem approaches to health is the real transformational potential of it. And I see it year after year. A few months after our courses, there'll always be someone who comes back to me. As director of programs, I get emails, people who have been out in the field and share with me their insights and how it connects to the learning that they went through during the course, or emails of gratitude, and that that opportunity to engage with that learning on a real transformational level brings me back year after year. So over to you, Margot.
Yeah, thank you, Jena. And thanks all of you for making time for this session today. We're so aware as we open up these spaces that there's just so much going on for everybody as in this swirling time of flux and challenge. And so I'm really appreciative to have this moment to consolidate and share some of our inspiring materials and insights from COPE Canada. For all of us to sort of ground in terms of some of the reasons that we're here. So as I begin, my name's Margot Parks. I'm a professor in the School of Health Sciences here at the University of Northern British Columbia. And I've been very fortunate to be living here at the confluence of the Nechako River, the Fraser, the Klataco. The confluence of the rivers is very much embedded in the territory in which I'm living in. The Klataco means the people of the confluence of the two rivers. And for me, somebody who all of my work as I've moved from somebody who grew up in Ngāi Tahu territory in Aotearoa on the southeast coast of New Zealand, and have had the good fortune to live and work all around the world. I'm somebody, my rivers have been my teachers and as one of my biggest references to the ecosystems that we're going to be talking about today in terms of our ecosystem approaches. And rivers are a connector for me, whether it's from the work that I did foundationally as I moved from my background as somebody in medicine, working clinically and working upstream, literally upstream, into the spaces of ecosystems and social systems that have informed my work over the last couple of decades. And that work that has taken me all around the world has had me here in Canada since 2005 and in Klataco territory since 2009. And I can say very comfortably that one of the things that has kept inspiring this relationship, this ongoing relationship with Canada, somebody who never really thought they would leave New Zealand in Aotearoa, but here I am some 15, 16 years later. And COPE Canada has been one of the very big community connections that has done that. A community of colleagues across Canada, but deeply connected with broader international conversations, as you'll understand. And that the work and learning also, as you'll hear about, that we've done as a community is not only a shared asset that we're really delighted is continuing to consolidate and grow, but also lands in our work and practice. So the things that we're going to hear about today have also deeply informed and enriched how I work as a professor, initially as a Canada Research Chair in Health, Ecosystems and Society, and continuing work that's based in watersheds, very focused to land, water, living systems, but deeply informed by this ecosystem approaches to health concepts and the teaching resources that we're delighted to be sharing with you, because there's some really exciting new ways that we've got to share the work that we've been doing together. So really importantly, it'll be reiterated, but COPE Canada is a community, it's a broad community. Several of you are here around the table, but we have colleagues across the country and another community of practices around the world. And we're really happy to give you this little glimpse of our teamwork today. So over to you, Jena.
Thanks, Margot. Just provide a brief outline of what we're going to be doing today. We'll go through some history of COPE Canada and ecosystem approaches to health, and then we'll give an overview of some of the concepts that are used in these approaches. We'll have a short break for clarifying questions, recognizing that we'll come back to a discussion at the end. Then we'll introduce you to the course that's coming up in May, June 2022, and we'll take you through our website and some of the teaching resources that you can find there. And then we'll have time for a discussion after all that and questions, of course.
And in that spirit, we would love to actually, there's a few of us here, we're so glad you've joined us, and it would be great to hear where you're calling in from, or if there's something that you're particularly interested about tuning into as we make this presentation. We love to have these sessions interactive, so use the chat box, let us know questions, thoughts, and where you're calling on from today. That'd be really nice for us to get a sense of.
Thanks, Margot. All right, so a little bit about the Canadian community of practice and each ecosystem approaches to health. We began in 2008 when we received funding from the International Development Research Center. And that funding was primarily to run some courses, field courses. And in 2016, we formed an official consortium between first 6 and now 8 universities with a memorandum of understanding in order to create the COPE Canada, which is an adaptive community of scholars and practitioners dedicated to the understanding, teaching, and application of ecosystem approaches to address current challenges to a healthy and sustainable global future. And so how do we do that? We do that primarily through teaching. So through between 2008 and 2015, we ran field courses. So these were intensive summer field courses that usually ran over about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, in which we had about 20 students together in the same place at the same time at one of the participating universities. And we got people out on the land, discovering watersheds, discovering communities, and working in small groups interactively. And we'll go into our teaching techniques a little bit more towards the end of the webinar. We ran these field courses from 2008, starting in UBC, at the University of Guelph, here in Montreal at UQAM in 2010, UNBC in Northern British Columbia in 2011, University of Moncton 2012, back to UNBC, York University, and then back to UQAM. And then in 2016, we switched to a hybrid format. We did this primarily thinking about greenhouse gas emissions and getting people localized in multiple sites rather than moving across the entire country. And also because our IDRC funding came to an end. The IDRC funding allowed us to provide a stipend to students in order to travel to the course. So we provided during that period small stipends for the 20 students to come. And afterwards, we ran a scholarship program where students could apply for funding for their research. And then once the research was done, apply for funding for knowledge translation activities. Starting in 2016, we moved to a multi-site approach where we had graduate study classes unfolding in multiple sites at the same time. And I'm going to go into the structure of the course when I present the 2022 course, but we've run one of those every year since 2016. And of course, the last 2 years, we had to bring a field course online, which is a challenge. I know teaching was challenging for everyone over the last few years of the pandemic, but especially for a field course. And we even wondered whether we should go forward in 2020, but we decided to innovate and have people getting out as much as they could into the places that were still open in directed forays. We had time for discussion online. We started including novels, which I'll talk about later, and we created a sense of a shared experience around the pandemic the first year. So we're fairly proud of having accomplished that, because basically what it means is that we've been able to run a course every year since 2008, 14 years running, and again in 2022. So like I said, most of our work is around teaching, but we've also done research on our teaching. So we've had a program of evaluative research in which we've looked at our own teaching techniques. We've used surveys from students, and we've pulled together this research into a few publications. And I'm going to pop the publications into the chat box when I'm finished speaking here, so you can look more into that research that we've done over the past 14 years. And I won't go into detail into this diagram. It's in the Cole et al. Paper. But basically what you see here on the top are each of the field courses. And on the bottom, it's the ways in which we've interacted with larger global activities over the course of time, and how those events have informed our teaching, and how our teaching has also been brought in to shape some of the things that were happening internationally. And that's a nice segue into Margot continuing on with the history of the ecosystem approach.
Yeah, thanks, Jena. So part of our journey, this is another figure in the Cole et al. Paper, And what's important here is that we've been building a community of practice, and we've also, which is sort of the red-brown color at the top of the swirling diagram, and then we've also been at the same time strengthening capacity to do this. And so some of that, as we move out this nested diagram, some of it's in our courses and workshops, but also we're all practicing and doing this work under different banners and different departments and different contexts and different countries, and we're contributing to the broader field development, which has been one of the exciting ways, this sort of nested dynamic that our team has created and really actively participated in across different processes of collaboration and also different processes of particular content and course development. So we'll go to the next slide, Jena. And it's lovely to see people popping in where they're calling in from. It's really neat to have a sense of who we're chatting to. So what is always worth underscoring, and this we can never quite figure the right way to put this sort of diagram together, but that eco-health and ecosystem approaches to health are part of a much wider conversation. There's a lot of convergence and confluence. It's important for us to acknowledge that many aspects of the way that Indigenous knowledges have thought about health and land and water and living systems have been doing this across millennia. And in many ways, a lot of Western ways of thinking have been kind of moving from that more colonial disconnected way towards this more integrative approaches. And so there's been lots of languages, and we're going to touch on why we find the particular language of ecosystem approaches to health really important for how we do our work. It's not just a name, it's a way of thinking, acting, relating, that also, if you get the chance to come to the French session as well, and that we communicate with our colleagues that it's in different contexts, that where we find that we are in conversation with all of these other titles, some of which we prefer to use and some of which we don't. But the next slides, what we're going to do is to talk a little bit about some of the history that's run alongside and informed Kope Canada. And this ecosystem approach idea is one that it's emerged from the field of ecology, but also a way of operating that is understanding the broader systems in which we live. And some people point to that very first use as an approach, not just as a thing or as a way of understanding ecology, but an approach and a way of thinking from the International Joint Commission. And then importantly in Canada, EcoHealth has a very strong anchor with the International Development Research Centre because of the extraordinary precedence of the international research that was funded all around the world. But as we reached into the early 2000s, there was a question of how can we consolidate how Canadians are working in other parts of the world and learning in other parts of the world and start to consolidate those lessons in Canada. And that's part of our story as Kope Canada, that is what we've done. We'll go to the next slide. So there was a very important event, heavily sponsored and initiated by the International Development Research Centre, which was an EcoHealth Forum in 2003, a really memorable conference for those of us that were there because of how deeply international it was and how across disciplines, practices, jurisdictions, professions. I just remember how vibrant that conversation, and I was a freshly minted PhD student then, wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, coming to Canada, seeing all this potential, and particularly intrigued by this COP thing, the communities of practice, which had been working in 2005 through Kope LAC, and then in 2008, Kope Canada. But there was also other communities of practice in other parts of the world. And alongside communities of practice, as we'll see in the next slide, was this emerging history. And we're giving you a pre-taster. Those of you that are on the call and interested in Kope Canada, when this Padlet becomes live, as you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner, we're making reference here to EcoHealth International. And there's a lot of attention right now at telling the history of EcoHealth as a field, and kudos to Angel Kennedy, who's on the call, who's one of the part of the emerging career community within EcoHealth International, bringing forth a sense of history and new developments. And so if we go to that next slide, this is a Padlet tool that we're creating a linear history, and we're going to be profiling that when it becomes live on our COPE Canada site, and it'll be on EcoHealth International as well. But there are little pieces of it, and we're particularly proud of our EcoHealth 2014 conference, which was another way that COPE Canada contributed to the field of ecohealth by hosting a conference and bringing our ecosystem approaches to health orientation. I'm particularly kind of interested in the nexus of these two things. For a period, I was in the role of president of what was then the International Association for Ecology and Health, and have been really inspired by this ongoing conversation COPE Canada's had. So going to the next slide, we're in this mode of looking at communities of practice. As we mentioned, they're in West Africa, they're in Latin America, there is in Middle East and North Africa, but there's also a gap that we were really keen to fill in Canada. On to the next slide. And so what we've got is communities of practice, largely funded by International Development Research Centre in Canada, and alongside the International Association for Ecology and Health that was created in 2006. Actually, there's a wee typo there, and had many iterations and conferences, as you'll hear, and emerged in 2018 under this new banner of EcoHealth International. On to the next slide. So these are the conferences that took place. And again, what I think is important here, we're not just telling this history for the sake of here is the history and all these events, but every time these communities convene, the communities of practice and EcoHealth were in conversation with each other, and people were progressing the field, they were seeing new developments, they were figuring out how is it that we can continue to push forward with this integrative work, learn from the teaching and learning opportunities, which COPE Canada was championing, learn from the research that's happening in the field, learn from the opportunity that these integrative approaches have to be applied and influencing policy and practices in different parts of the world. A real emphasis here is just how international this broader community is. I'll go to the next slide, Jena. So then we come to this zone of what is amidst that. Why, with all of this language, do we find this ecosystem approaches to health language so helpful? And so we're just going to take you on a little walk around through that language, and we're going to dwell for a moment on the next slide with this really important word, which is important for me. It's also important in terms of how I teach and how I think about this word. And here in green on the side is this eco. And in this context, we really want to flag that eco is the same word, it's the same prefix as it is an economy. And that's because we're talking about eco as both a Greek and Latin originated word that refers to oikos, or to our home. And so importantly, we're landing this thinking in our home. We're thinking about approaches to health that are grounded in our home, but in a broad sense of not just our home and the house that we live in, but our home nested within the living systems that we depend on, both socially and ecologically. And so there's a lot of language out there. You'll see ecohealth is spelt in all sorts of different ways. I increasingly spell it without a capital, because in fact, like many fields, we sort of go through this process of initially a field having all these different versions of capitals, but importantly landing to just being part of the conversation of how we understand the world. There is also, for many of you are familiar with ecological determinants of health, and increasingly languages around eco-social approaches to health, being really clear that if we're taking a fully systems understanding, we're not just thinking about the natural environment without a clear interaction with the social systems that we depend on. So we're going to run through some of these words a little bit more and welcome us in. We'll go to the next slide to be aware that at that core that we were just talking about, that eco as our home, it's got a really important implication in terms of how we think of the relatedness and the connectedness of things. And here we referred earlier to the ways in which Indigenous knowledges are deeply informing and in conversation with these fields. In particular, I love this image of the circle, where when we're thinking about an ecological or an informed by oikos in our home, it's not just humans, but also humans in all our relations, and humans embedded within living systems where we are not bodies separated from the systems that we depend on, and that we're really deeply interested in those systems interactions. Systems thinking is central to ecology. It's not only from ecology, but thinking about systems and their interactions and that relatedness, that connectedness, those interactions. It's that way of thinking that is often at a deep struggle for more classic approaches to health, which have so effectively tried to separate things out in order to be able to understand them. So this is why some of the reasons why, if we're thinking about ecosystem approaches to health, this word ecosystem is important. Another word, as we go to the next slide, that is very important to this thinking is the plural of approaches. So that's something that we've lent into, of not just thinking about one approach. There's not just one way to do this work. There's multiple ways that are incorporating in relation to different contexts, and that's from a point of view of how we design things. We do need to think about plural approaches, so that when we're thinking about these systems approaches, we're talking about, in the context that we're in, finding a good way to work with interested parties and community members to address issues at the interface of health, ecosystems, and society. And so in the list of references that Jena was going to share as well, is that idea that we've been writing and thinking about these pieces for a while. So then we get to this other word. We've talked about ecosystem approaches, and then there's this word health. And importantly, as we continue to be aware of, there are lots of increasing healths out there. There is every kind of health you could imagine. There's planetary health, and there's One Health, and there's global health. And in many ways, I think you could have ecosystem approaches to any of those healths. What we're really underscoring, each of us in our community of practice have developed our own language and our own ways of understanding how health and well-being matters in our work. There is not one way to understand health and well-being in this work. So this figure in particular, I'm owning it. This is a figure that I've been grappling with for years now. It's been evolving over multiple decades of experiences, and it's one that I've moved on from and come back to. But for me, the recurring things are not just that we need to think about health and well-being in relation to ecosystems and social systems, but we also need to be attendant to the driving forces of change, whether that is, as we are talking about right now, the driving forces that are driving the floods and mudslides and deep impacts on social systems and ecosystems in BC and Newfoundland, or whether it is those driving forces of colonization that Jena mentioned earlier, that we're so aware, and communities not far from where I'm calling in from, there in the Gidimt'en is being taken off their territory by the RCMP for protecting landscapes. Really complex issues that are still underplaying and influencing health and well-being. So these are some of the things we're holding in our mind when we're grappling with ecosystem approaches to health. And each of those, as you'll hear about shortly, we've been really looking for the patterns of things that are the most important when we're thinking about that. So I think that's me.
Yeah,
handing over to you, Jena.
Great segue again. So one of the things that's been very interesting and valuable about the ecosystem approaches to health is that it's looked to other disciplines, other areas of research to collect some of the best practices and to compile them, to bring them together and to learn from previous practice and research and build a set of principles and methodologies and visions and standpoints that we can look to build a holistic picture of whatever issue we're wanting to understand and intervene in. And these have evolved over time. So in the beginning, they were spoken of as pillars, and there were three. So Forget and Lebel wrote a paper in 2001, which talked about transdisciplinarity, participation, and social and gender equity as being the three pillars of the ecosystem approaches to health. Those were used, trialed further in the field by EcoHealth practitioners, and more thinking went into them, and exploration of other aspects, other theories, methodologies from other fields, and they were built upon. And in 2012, Sharon, who was also working with the IDRC, published a book in which she added to those three pillars complexity or systems thinking, ecosystem sustainability, and knowledge to action. And so these became the 6 principles of ecosystem approaches to health. At COPE Canada, we prefer to think of them as patterns or orientations. We don't think of them so much as a checklist to check off, and we've begun displaying them in this circular form where the colors sort of bleed into one another, and they're sort of nested and interact with one another. But we do find them useful, and they are practices that have been used in a wide array of fields that have really proven to be effective and useful. And so we do teach around these 6 patterns. And that's what we're going to do a little bit now. We go into much more detail in the course, but we're going to give you a broad overview of these 6 patterns. And I'll jump in with social and gender equity. It doesn't really matter where we begin on that circle. When we talk about social and gender equity in the context of ecosystem approaches to health, we're really inviting people to look at the ways in which our socioeconomic structures influence the health risks that people are exposed to, their access to health care, and their health status, and how this is not equal across all members of society. So I've pulled here a figure from a paper by Marmot and Allen, in which they did a bit of an overview of different studies that looked into the contribution to the main drivers of health status. So these were different studies, but the point being that in the dark purple, what you see are factors that can be described as either socioeconomic factors, social circumstances, or lumped as other. The point being that usually when you come down to think about it, more than half of what's contributing to our health status is not things like genetics or healthcare, but are more things like access to healthcare, or the environments we live in, our class structures, social structures, or gender. So this aspect, this pattern of the work that we do invites us to really apply a gender or a social lens that helps us to understand and explore these drivers to health status, and then also helps us look for interventions that are going to be equitable. So it's looking upstream to the sources of health, negative health outcomes, and it's also looking downstream to potential solutions or interventions. And so this is a figure I like to present to people by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And if you're thinking about equality and solutions or interventions, you might think providing a bike to everyone in a poor neighborhood of an urban environment would help them access different areas of the neighborhood, get around. But when you think in terms of equity, you'll realize that not everyone needs the same bike. So we really need to apply this gender and social equity lens to the work upstream, looking for problems, looking at problems and exposures, but also downstream when we come to working towards solutions. Moving to another pattern, knowledge to action. It's also referred to sometimes as research to action, or knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization. There's many different words to describe a category of postures towards creating research that generates tangible outcomes and improves the health and well-being of people. And this vision has several characteristics. One is that it's dynamic, which means that it's not an end of grant publication of a paper, but it's something that's going on throughout the process. There are many touch points at which we can bring our knowledge into action. It's also multi-directional, which means it's not top-down. It's not researchers informing communities about proper behaviors. It's a process, multi-directional, from researchers to community, from community to researchers. And when Margot's going to talk about transdisciplinarity, it goes across all of these boundaries. How do we share information in a way that works towards improved health and well-being? It can also be challenging. It can be challenging to bring so many points of view into one space, but in the end, it's rewarding. It's rewarding in terms of the relationships the trusting relationships that are formed, and also in terms of the results. Another of the patterns is ecosystem sustainability. And when I teach this, I usually, as Margot did, stop and look at the word ecosystem. But since we've already done that, I'm going to look a little bit about what ecosystem sustainability isn't. Ecosystems, as Margot pointed out, are living systems that exist on their own. Ecosystem sustainability, in our vision of it, is not sustainable development, which is often presented in terms of 3 dimensions: the environment, the social, and the economic. We don't adopt this viewpoint primarily because the economy is part of the social realm. Economy doesn't exist independent of our societal structures. So in this, what appears to be an equally balanced figure, we're actually double weighting the human systems and to the detriment of the non-human systems. And when we do end up talking about sustainability, it's often in this economic language that comes to dominate. But that's not necessarily the case in all cultures. And I'll just give you one example. This is a French anthropologist, Descola, who's worked with the Achuar people in Ecuadorian and Peruvian Amazon for many, many years. And through his work, he's been able to bring to us the point of view of the Achuar people, in which women relate to, talk about, interact with plants in a similar way as they do with their children. And men, hunters, interact with, relate to, talk about the animals that they hunt in a similar way as they do their brothers-in-law. So this is another way of approaching the ecosystem based on relationships. And so we look towards the relationships that we have with the ecosystem, but also the relationships that exist within the ecosystem. And once we start identifying, exploring, understanding these relationships and looking towards building healthy relationships, that's when we start talking about sustainability. And Margot will talk more about systems in her section.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we get excited about these topics and we always end up rushing through them a little bit, which is why you need to come back for the course. But I am going to rush through these slides, and because each of these ideas, they're very interwoven, and we've already touched on many of these ideas. But transdisciplinarity is a really important one because it is, especially for those of you that are based in the academy, it means going beyond the constraints of different disciplines. And for me, the most important part of this transdisciplinarity idea is the word beyond. That's what the prefix trans means. It means going beyond the other thing. So we're going beyond disciplines and not just connecting between them, but thinking about crossing disciplinary and sectoral boundaries to have different conversations that expand beyond the academy. And so it's often behooved us to find a common vision that's bringing that together and drawing on the richness and strength of different approaches. So on to the next slide, Jena. And there's lots of ways we can understand this. We have some references here to share. I really do enjoy the Pohl and Hirschhayden work around this that talk about the way that we're finding ways to better attend to the wicked problems of our time, and that we're invoking appropriately complex approaches to complex issues that don't ever imagine you could find a solution just from in one jurisdiction or discipline or way of understanding things. So that connects with the next pattern or principle, which is this very important idea around complexity and systems thinking. And many people use different analogies to talk about what is the difference between something that's complicated. And the third point under here is really the key message, that you could actually have a plan to do something complicated. You could build, assemble, disassemble, reassemble something, a rocket in flight of the moon or an airplane. It's complicated, but this idea of complexity takes us to a whole different level where you can't just disassemble and reassemble something in the same way. You can't make a salad in exactly the same way as you did last time, nor can you grow up a kid from one kid to another, or any of these idea of ways that there's something emergent that happens with complexity, and that it requires not just a plan, but I always struggle with the word model, but theories and deeper ways of understanding those connections. And so to the next slide, this idea of participation. So if we're taking all of these patterns of ideas, it really matters who we're engaging with when we're doing it, and that we're not just doing it as a discrete phase of the research, but we're thinking about how participation plays out throughout the entire journey of conceiving, potentially using research, but also using other ways of knowledge consolidation and integration. So if we go to this next slide, as I mentioned earlier, we all find our ways to talk about these ideas of participation. And again, this is not the right way to think about it. It is just a way that has really influenced my thinking, that we need to not think of participation as long lists of stakeholders that have to be included at all times, but a thoughtful way where we think of who are we involving, how are we involving them? There's different ways in which people may participate in terms of the roles they're playing. And if you look on the y-axis there, that there's different ways people can be involved and participate in research. And I think it really matters where we're participating, so that all of these things are invoking real people in real places to be part of this journey of understanding complex issues and finding paths forward. So we wanted to take you on the swing through, and we've got to this last slide of the circle. We've thrown lots of ideas, we've given you tasters, and we're about to share with you some more insights about our resources. But over to you, Jena, I think, to think about if there's any burning questions, and before we give you this taster of these exciting new resources we've got available.
Yeah, we were just going to take a few minutes pause. I'll stop sharing the screen and be able to check the chat box. I was in full screen mode and couldn't do that. So we could field any more clarifying types of questions at this point. If there are any, you can turn on your mic, put on your camera. And at the same time, I'm going to put in that list of references that I wasn't able to do while I was in full screen.
So while Jena does that, any queries, any curiosities about particularly where EcoHealth fits in your work, or ways in which you might be curious? We will come back to have some more discussion in a bit, but happy to have any queries now. I think some people have stepped on and off as well.
We have a question here. Yeah, you want to take that, Margot, while I...
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So such a good question, and so important. One thing I would mention is that to my earlier point, I don't use the phrase ecosystem health. And I could talk a lot about why I don't, but it's for the reasons I was alluding to earlier, which is that ecosystem health to me is not the same as an ecosystem approach to health. And so I don't often find myself distinguishing with ecosystem health. Ecosystem health does have an origin that had a very particular emphasis that maybe we could manage and adapt with ecosystems by thinking of the characteristics that might make them healthy and measuring and monitoring so that we could move them towards that healthy state. That's not really what we're bringing forward with ecosystem approaches to health. As we've emphasized, we're bringing forward these approaches, these ways of working together. But One Health has a very particular origin, which particularly comes from the connection around animals and humans, and has a particular origin in relation to zoonoses, but has gone well beyond it. And at its best, I would say there are things that are very hard to distinguish. A really integrative approach to One Health that is genuinely engaging with ecosystems as well as humans and animals, that is genuinely engaging with some of these principles that we've put forward. And many of our colleagues who teach with us in our ecosystem approaches to health course also our One Health colleagues. So, but the differences are really the emphasis, and I think in that we're not always focusing on animal health in ecosystem approaches to health, and One Health is usually bringing in overtly other animal species as a point of interaction. And it also has an origin that is very closely linked with the veterinarian and medical profession in ways that I would argue EcoHealth's origins are much richer and broader in terms of the foundational disciplinary origins. But a really good question, and probably worth some further discussion. I hope that's a little bit helpful, Julie. Great. Well, Jena, why don't we dive on? We'll keep an eye on the chat box, but I'm excited about the reveal of our our resources and other things that people might find helpful.
Okay, I'll share my screen again. And as we've said, we will have time for a discussion later. All right, so here we are again. At this point, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about our course, and I'm happy to see there are a few people on the call who have taken our course. So that comes back to what I mentioned at the very beginning. These courses can be very generative spaces, and we've been really fortunate to have a group of alumni, emerging scholars who have stayed close to the community of practice over the years and enriched it, and we've all been learning together. So this year's course is going to be taking place, well, next year's course is going to be taking place mostly in the month of May, spilling over a little bit into June. It's the hybrid format again, so we will have 3 full graduate level courses running for 3 credit at 3 institutions at UQAM here in Quebec, and the on-site sessions will be in French at the University of Guelph and at UNBC. So at each of these sites, instructors at the university are responsible for orienting the students and designing most of the course material and the field visits. And then the 3 sites meet periodically over the course of the 6 to 8 weeks on 8 2-hour webinars. And so these are touch points where the students from different sites have the opportunity to meet each other, discuss, collaborate, and share an experience of ecosystem approaches to health that's broader than they would simply at their university site. The webinars, this is the schedule from last year's webinar. So the order will be different and maybe the presenters will be different, but basically how we usually run it is we have an introduction similar to today, but we spend more time going over the different concepts. And then we deal with usually each of the patterns in one separate webinar. So we have a lot of time to go into detail about the methodologies or the frameworks that are used. And these webinars are interactive. So there's 2 hours of webinar. There's usually 1.5 hours dedicated to the topic, of which there'll be sometimes up to half interactive components, breakout rooms, discussion questions, reflection questions, surveys, something to get people moving and thinking actively. And then a very deliberate activity that gets people sharing things across sites. And then we end with a synthesis webinar in which the students from the 3 university sites present their coursework, their final group work presentation around a theme that we've chosen that's common to all 3 universities. And these webinars can be taken also as a standalone. So you can sign up for just the 8 webinars, 2-hour webinars, so that's 16 hours of webinars without needing to be a student enrolled in a university. And we give a COPE Canada certificate for having followed the webinar series. We teach towards concrete learning objectives. So these orient our teaching, and I'm not going to go through them all, but they're accessed on applicability and gearing and guiding participants to be able to apply the principles or the patterns and reflect critically and translate these concepts into their own work. And we do this through different interactive activities throughout the course of the time we spend together. And we think of this as learning for application. And these are the tools that I'm going to present in the next section that we've developed over the course of our 14 years working together. This is just a sample here, but we begin by giving students a poster template, and we ask them to lay out their research project or some other project that they've been working on, maybe at their work, in an adapted academic poster format. And then we have them come back to that poster throughout the course after each webinar to look at how they can integrate some of the concepts that they've just seen into their work. So maybe they're working on access to water and they haven't thought about the gender aspect. So after the gender webinar, they can revisit their work and look at the areas in which there might be some gender considerations that we're missing. We have students write blogs on a topic of their choice, which we encourage them to use their own research. And this helps them to communicate about their own findings, their own topic of choice in simple terms and concisely. And then we have the students reading each other's work and providing feedback. So they are able to get feedback on their communication skills and also to provide feedback. And we actually grade them on their feedback. So we're helping them to become citizens that provide meaningful feedback to their peers. We have a final paper, and at UCAM this year we did a situational learning topic, which I'll show you when we get to the teaching resources. We usually have an overarching theme. Last year and this year it's working the hyphen, navigating the space between advocacy and academia. So here we're looking at the boundaries between action-oriented work and research-oriented work, the concept of being a researcher versus a community member, and how to interact on those levels within communities. And this is usually what the final group work is oriented to, and we encourage people to come up with a creative and interactive way of presenting their themes and their thoughts on the theme. And we always work around a case study. So when we've been able to get out into the field, we do field visits. I've just given one example here. We've used almost as many case studies as we've had run courses. Last year here at UCAM, we looked at the conversion of former Gulf courses into housing developments. And so when it's not pandemic years, we would go visit green spaces, we would talk to community members, hear about their issues, why they're fighting to conserve a green space. In the past 2 years, since we haven't been able to go out in the field, we've started integrating narrative readings, so novels and poetry collections. And we pre-selected and carefully chose books that have a strong connection to land, and also in which several of the other principles are put forth. And so we've asked participants to read just one of the books, and provided touch points throughout the course where they can discuss the book or discuss the themes of the book or the importance of art and literature and transdisciplinarity in approaching the different issues at the confluence of health, society, and the environment. So if anything in today's session has interested you, it's really easy to sign up. You can find all the information you want on our website. This is what the landing page for the course website looks like. And I'm going to take you to our website next. So we'll provide you with those links in the chat box because they're not clickable here. But if you want to participate in the full course, you can go through one of the participating universities. You don't have to be enrolled at that university. There's a lot of ways of transferring credits, and we can help you navigate that. If you want to just attend the webinars or do some sort of an audit variation, you can contact us, and our email is there. And you can also follow us on Twitter because we'll be putting the announcements there. And we send announcements out also to people who have expressed interest. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the teaching resources, and we're going to come back to questions in just a few minutes. So over the years, we've collected some of those teaching techniques into a teaching manual. We brought together the people who had been involved in the first 4 iterations of the course with an international group to build a teaching manual that came out in 2012. And I'd like to give a real loud shout out to Suzanne McCullough, who can't hear me right now. She's not on the call, but she really guided us through this process in a very structured way that helped us to get our ideas and our what we were actually doing into words into this manual, and oriented us around goals, learning objectives, guiding questions, discussion questions, reflective prompts, key content, and very importantly, the activities, writing out in very clear step-by-step terms what exactly we do in our teaching. And each of the modules, which I will show you now, are presented in a similar way. So it's easy for someone who's looking across several modules to orient themselves within the document. So the original teaching manual included these 8 modules. And since then, we have expanded to include new modules and new teaching resources of different types. And that's what I'm going to bring you to now. This is what the website looks like. We're actually revealing these resources in the current format for the first time. Now, this is a bit of a launch for us. So we're really excited for feedback on the discussion, or really at any time. So when you come into our website, everyone can see my website. Thanks for your enthusiasm, Margot, and Bob, thank you. So we can see the website now. So just to go back a few steps, if you're looking for information on the course, you'll find it either in this dark blue bubble here, or by going through areas of action, training, and capacity COPE Canada course. But right now, what I want to show you is the teaching resources page. And we've divided the new material up into 9 themes, which you can find here. And you can click on any one of these, and it'll bring you to a page where we've collected teaching resources on that particular theme. So in this case, it's ecosystem approaches to health principles and histories. And in the first block, what you'll find is our own teaching resources. Often it's the initial module or the new modules that we've created. And when you click on it, you end up in a PDF, which will bring you to the introductory material and also the activities. But you can also find it in a web version, which is fully clickable. So you can choose to look specifically at the activity on eco, health plus process, and it'll open it up for you, and you'll see the different steps that we use when we're teaching on these topics. After the content in a modular form, we have a section where we are providing you with video or audio resources that you can use in a flipped course, which has been really helpful for a lot of teachers over the past 2 years, inviting students to watch a video and then holding a discussion with them about the material. So what we've done is these are videos from the EcoHealth 2014 conference. There's also other interviews that we've done over the years. And we've pulled out a lesson related to the theme that you're in that you can pull out and discuss with your students after having watched. We also have a link to a really important project that we carried out a few years ago with our Latin American colleagues, in which we built an entire course modular format as well in Spanish, which you can find by clicking on the link. And it has an audio over a PowerPoint presentation, usually a full 90 minutes on each topic, if you're able to follow in Spanish. And then we'll have a section on other resources. So if we just go to look at another one really briefly, this is a new one that we're really excited about, because in the next few weeks, we'll have 2 new modules here around the theme of upstream as a place. So it's really taking us into how do you teach on the land, in the field, and some really concrete activities around that. And this here is a guide that the students from this year's course at UCAM 2001 produced for their final coursework. So we had them doing situational learning, in which we asked them to contact the community group that's working towards the protection of a green space and to work with them towards something that would be beneficial to the community group. So one group chose a woodland area outside of Quebec City. They contacted the community group and asked them what might be useful. The community group said that they were trying to involve the local elementary school in getting to know the woodland and maybe eventually helping them to protect it. And one of the members of this group was an education specialist working towards her master's in education. And so they decided to produce a guide for mindfulness education in elementary school workers, elementary school kids in this area. So it's really exceptional. It's the final product of this year's coursework here at UCAM, and you can check it out on our site. Once again, we have the EcoSante work and other resources. And just the final little exploration of our cross-cutting tools. This is where you'll find a lot of the techniques that we use for learning for applications. So you'll find the posters here, the case studies, the rich picture maps, reflective journaling, and some other resources that we found online. So these resources are free and available to all of you. We really welcome you to use them, trial them, give us feedback on how they work. Also, if you know of some other resources out there that are really exceptional, you can send us links to those, and we'll include them in the other resources section. So we really hope that this can be useful and that this will continue to grow over the next few years. I will just stop sharing my screen.
I'm not even going to do it with my icon. I'm going to give you a big vigorous clap.
Yes.
Jena has done such a fantastic job of weaving together and finding ways to share this sort of richness of experience that we have across our community. We're very excited that this is now a new way to share these resources. And Deanne, you've already started us off with a really great question and a great affirmation that you think this is going to be a good resource. But can you, if you're up for it, Deanne, do you want to turn on your microphone and just share this really important question you're asking about inviting different disciplines and professions into this space?
Oh, I'm happy to do that. And as always, I'm in 3 places at the same time. So
yes,
the Canadian Nurses Association just had their first summit on racism, so I couldn't miss some of that.
No, you couldn't.
These are important times, and I'm often struck when I'm moving in and out of community that there's these great conversations happening, and I look around the table at who's there and then who's not there. And I think historically nursing's probably just fill the room with techno jargon and biomedical model and expertise. And I just wonder, how do we invite ourselves back into these important circles? And I think this is really going to be fabulous because I think the land, of course, Margot, how I feel about that. But having these sort of already developed is just so helpful when you're trying to move something forward.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Deanne. And I think that sense of potential, that sense of frustrated potential we all have, these conversations waiting to happen that people are looking forward to. What I think I'd underscore is just how I think most people, I'm sure Erin's nodding her head about this, where can this sort of come to life and in the context of nursing? And yet most people that come to our courses kind of have the same experience, Deanne. I think it's fair to say that their home place is fringe to where their home place sits. And I often use this kind of daisy diagram in my mind, that if you think of everything being there's a whole lot of people that feel like this is at the fringe of their profession or their field or their discipline. But if you put all those fringes together, if you think of them all as petals and you put those fringes together, at the core is actually what we're talking about. We're trying to build with this work that sense of connection across what is actually a very large common ground. that whether it's medicine or nursing or planning or veterinary practice or international development or community development or whatever, people are looking for these spaces, and they do often feel like they're at the fringe. So we often joke that by joining those fringes together, we feel a sense of community. And so that's actually, I think, one of the skills that we gain is being able to be in communities that do talk about and make these connections, and then move back into other spaces that are not making them all the time, and allow, I can't tell you, I mean, Jena could probably give you the stats on it, but our courses are so diverse. We just have, so when we run our courses across programs, our graduate level courses, and also importantly, as Jena has said, the professional development opportunity, which is really neat. If people can scratch out, you know, this a little bit of time over this period, they can come and be part of these discussions, totally part of our course. They don't get a credit, but they do get a certificate and they get welcomed. So we're just so open to your thoughts about how we could, you know, part of this push we're doing now, and Erin, thanks so much for having another query there. Part of this push is to make this material as available as possible, and then to think about how we might, in a knowledge to action mode, figure out how to get it out in ways that could be even more accessible, or invite people in a more inclusive way if that's what we need to do. Erin, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. So exciting to start off with nursing. And thanks for the great presentation as well. That was such a nice refresher, and I really appreciated all the references, and that is a little bit of what I'm doing here, is that this has always resonated with me around like a meaningful community of practice, because I think that's something else in healthcare, that there's many communities of practice that maybe aren't as yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the diagram with the principles, patterns, things like that, and looking and thinking about those and how those are enacted. And also the website is terrific, and thinking about how you know, we can start to use those resources, and that is a little bit of why I'm here, is partly, you know, with two hats on, is like, so I'm academic lead for a rural nursing certificate program. And so really thinking about, you know, things that rural nurses can engage with in a different way, and especially in settings where they don't have access to many things, including, you know, sometimes academic resources and things like that. And then also just around like the transdisciplinary piece, which I think your group has always done so well and explained so robustly. In terms of, I think, building capacity for rural healthcare professionals and in rural health systems, because, you know, like how we support people to work and what their role is, and in rural communities, what that looks like. And so I don't, you know, clearly I don't have a really meaningful comment, except to say that this all really resonates, and I really appreciate the resources that have been offered, and that I'll definitely be on the website and looking around. So thank you. And I think Michael Pollan said that life is liveliest at the margins. So yeah,
nice, Erin. And well, and there's conversations, Erin is at UNBC, and there's conversations, I think, they sort of feel readier to have about how we can create meaningful ways to, we're getting more creative about how we can create these sort of elective or selective models of how people can tune into something like this, not necessarily taking the nursing version, because we've had lots of nurses taking the course over the years, but making it feel like a celebrated, valued, legitimate, timely, selective or elective for people within their existing studies, without having to wait to divert the whole curriculum. And that's one of the things that it's not, we want to see both things happen. Curriculums evolve, but we also want to create these resources. So Jena, there's a really lovely reinforcement for all the work you've been doing. Angela, I can see your hand up there if you want to go ahead.
Hi, Margot. It's so great to see you. I've had the pleasure of working with you when I was in Northern Health. a number of years ago now, so it's really great to see your face again. I'm coming from the capacity of a built environment consultant with Island Health. I'm out of Victoria right now. And, in public health, we've been shifting from one, seems like state of emergency through another the last couple of years with public health emergencies, climate change, drastic emergency measures in place in, recent months, in past couple of years. Just had a conversation this morning that was very timely. I talked to one of our medical health officers this morning where we talked about, developing frameworks for resiliencies with communities to engage with our local governments. So instead of being so reactionary to an emergency that we see ourselves in currently with the flooding and the mudslides and the cutoff from transportation networks and supplies, to building capacity for resilience so that we are ready to bring our communities through these difficult times instead of, oh God, this happened, what do we do now? As opposed to, these are our plans, this is our format, this is what we're going to do. And there's always the piece with mental health, tying in resilience with that too, because there's that added pressure, there's layers and layers on top of us right now. It's not just health protection and public health and that wellness, physical wellness, and getting our supplies and our food, food security issues and things like that. It's that impact on our mental health. To me, it's all connected. I can't separate any physical, mental, emotional well-being, and it's connected to the environment. So this seems so timely to have that conversation this morning, now linked into ecosystem health, because really our health right now, it's dependent on our environment, whether it's our forests or our water systems. We're so deeply connected that when something falls apart, we're stranded. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to the webinar on resilience and sustainability, and that knowledge to action. It's not just gaining that information, is moving that forward through public health into our local communities and making them more resilient and stronger. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Angela. And I feel that we're still emerging as a community practice with this sort of latest consolidation, and our hope is that we do often end up raising more questions than we answer for people with these courses, because we're opening spaces to talk about, as you just said. I was just feeling like, imagine, will our resilience session actually grapple properly with Angela's big question? But that's the point, is that you don't get the answer from a session. What you do enter into is a conversation with other colleagues whose actual experience. That's what I love about our courses. And I just wonder, Jena, could you just lean in for a minute to the sort of the professional development piece that we've been seeing slowly expand, about who comes and what they experience and how we we sort of consider them as a cluster in their own right. Can you just share a bit more about that? So, because I imagine Angela might want to share with other people about what that experience might be like.
Of course. The first, I think it was 2-3 years of the field course. It was sort of strictly more conventional graduate students, and then we had the idea of front loading the field course with a lot of the concepts for 3.5 days that could be attended as a professional development workshop, and then continuing on with the graduate students. And then when we moved to the hybrid version, a really logical place to expand on that concept was through the webinars, because they can be joined in from anywhere. So we really think of the webinars as a standalone with the sandwich of an introduction and the principles, and then a conclusion. And as we're working through the cross-site activities, we really look to the webinar participants, as Margot was saying, as a group, a cohesive group. So we have basically 4 sites. We have the 3 university sites, and we have the webinar group. And each time we have an activity, we invite, they're mostly professional development people, and a few grad students who didn't need credits and didn't need to follow the full version. And knowing that people are often busy, each time we do a cross-site activity, we invite the webinar participants to join us if they like, time permitting. So for example, for the poster, a professional development person can work on a poster throughout the course, and we pair people. And so if I know ahead of time, I'll pair them with someone from one of the universities. They'll be able to get the feedback in the same way that the university students are getting feedback. Same with the blog. If a professional development person wants to write a blog, it'll be shared along with all the rest. Feedback will be given. It goes into our competition. We have a vote for the 3 best blogs, and then those are published on our website in the emerging scholar section. So at each one of these moments of connection across the webinars, across the 4 different sites, professional development people can jump in to their capacity, or also just listen to the 8 webinars and engage in that way. Margot, did you have anything to add to how we run that?
Yeah, no, I think it's neat for people to just get that sense. And I think the professional development zone and initially we used to run these as intensive weekends where people came together, and we had 3.5 days with people, which was really neat to have that sort of moment. But it's what we're finding is that it's still an intensive block. You do get that sense of you're diving in and immersing and stepping out again, and that people that group is expanding each year. So whether people are at grad school or in the thick of their working lives and looking for ways to think about things, we're hoping it's a good model that'll deepen.
Yeah, about the populations. The last couple of years we've had between 30 and 40 participants. About 18, 20 are graduate students, and then the other group are the webinar participants. So having about 15, something like that, webinar participants. So that works out nicely with pairing people, getting people, we keep track of who's been in a breakout room. We get people mixed up as much as we can, and interacting with new people each time.
Yeah, and I think if we can have we've thought about running things in parallel. We've also thought about having, one of the things we're aiming for in the future is to sort of have some little dense little workshops, starter workshops, sort of routinely in the fall, is something that we're also thinking about doing. Some people that don't know if they want to commit to sort of 6 weeks of interaction, but would be willing to come to maybe a weekend workshop and just have a wee think about this. The other piece that we're finding is that lots of different health related professions are starting to imagine this sort of thinking. Again, it's to Erin's earlier query of a sort of a selective/elective path and so environmental health officers keep coming up. How do we enable these fabulous group of colleagues who are working in environment and health to for many of them, they entered into this space thinking they might be connecting environment and health in these interesting ways, and often environmental health training is very technical and kind of legislation based, and so we're exploring how we may actually be able to build elective sort of selective, I don't want to call it a specialization, but a deepening of this sort of work coming in conjunction with existing professions. Yeah, that's right, Erin. It's and we're I think that as we mature, we're really going to figure out how to serve these kinds of communities.
Thank you. That's quite exciting to bring more of the environment into environmental health, because you're correct. It's quite technical, legislative based, but without that environment piece, we can fall apart, which we are a little bit right now. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you've raised the disaster preparedness piece, Angela, because that just keeps coming up for most people working in health at the moment, is that these very sped up public health sort of issues in the form of disasters. And we have had on occasion colleagues from the disaster preparedness scene, not so much the disaster response scene, but and that's cracking open a whole nother world of who does this work. So thanks for doing the work yourself. I'm glad that you're in where you are, Angela. Any other queries from anybody?
Hi, maybe I can just add, it's sort of more reflections, I guess, but from the international development side of things, I work for an organization called WaterAid, which does water sanitation and hygiene globally. And I think being here in Canada with many of the NGO coalitions, you know, there's a coalition for women and children's health, and then there's a coalition for climate and resilience. And, you know, the two are just completely separate conversations. And we know, you know, we're being asked through the World Health Assembly and through G20 and everything to be looking more at One Health and where do these things come together in sort of, you know, the pandemic preparedness discussions and climate resilience discussions, and how do we bring those together? So I think, thank you all, I guess, for the conversation today, because lots of learning for me, which is where I'm at, and learning how to, you know, in my work for water sanitation and hygiene, how do we thread these things together? So don't know what that is, but this is a really great start. So thank you very much. But yeah, I think I'd be interested to explore a bit, maybe in terms of, you know, the advocacy work that we do here in Canada with these coalitions, if there's opportunities to bring some of those conversations together somehow. I'm just throwing that out there. But then also in some of the work with my country program colleagues as well, in terms of, you know, we're asking of them to be WASH professionals, to be health professionals, to be climate professionals and water security. And yet somewhere, somehow, this has to all piece together. And I feel like all those, like you're talking about the fringes, I think that very much, I don't know, I feel like it can come together more under this conversation, drawing all these pieces together, because I really think it's a big gap in the conversations that we're having anyways for water sanitation and hygiene. So all that to say, I don't know if I have a question or not, but just really interesting, and I'll be interested to follow up on the resources that you shared and the probably the webinar section, and see even if I can share it with some of my colleagues as well. So so just some reflections, but thank you very much for the conversation. Really, really interesting stuff. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
And I think, Julie, we're always figuring out how to respond, but one of the things COPO Canada has sort of opened itself up to is that, you know, if there was a targeted moment where a group of people were interested, and we've sort of offered workshops that could be done on an ad hoc basis, that if it's not something that we are learning how to figure out to make that as something that we can offer, and the community can kind of have some resources to help us do this gluing. So we're still learning about that, but we're seeing the increasing need for it. And, you know, it's an invitation to folks that attend this session. If there's something really specific that you are interested in, Jena, as our director of programs, might be able to figure something out, and that we're learning about how to package things to respond to different funders' needs and different groups' needs and so on. So there are, you know, we're hopeful that our routinely offered contributions like that, being a webinar participant in a course, could be relevant, but we're aware it might not work for everybody. Any other queries from anybody about anything specific, or points of curiosity, or suggestions? One thing, if before you go, I probably missed it earlier, but we're actually really curious to know how people found out about today. So if you're able to sort of just let us know if there was a link, because those are also links that we can follow up on, and I think we have the capacity through the registration thing to make sure we let people know when the materials and everything are also going to be online. This session will be recorded as well, or is being recorded and available.
I must say, I randomly found out about it on Twitter, is how I found out about it. So yeah, that was it was a lucky moment. So thanks.
Thanks, Jena. Look at you, outreach queen. That's So good. That makes it, oh, that's so good, Joanna. Thank you. Well, it's really nice to hear that, because Jena does a great job of just putting out some of these things, and we really appreciate it. So it's really good to get that positive feedback.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback. It's nice to know that that pans out and reaches new audiences.
Well, I think hearing no burning further queries, it's always nice, because people's days, although in Eastern Canada, you're probably getting ready to end your day, some of us are getting ready for our afternoon and probably have new things happening at 2. So I think in the absence of that, Jena, I can't remember now whether we had, other than all these links and the sort of building up of our suite of resources that we're cobbling together, well, is there anything else that we needed to share as we put a wrap on the session?
No, and thanks. I was able to see the chat that you were putting those up in real time as I was speaking. That's quite a talent, Margot. Thank you. So
well,
I think if you don't know, you could copy the chat box, right? I think if you put everyone knows how to do that. The three little lines at the bottom right. It should say copy the chat, or I'm in French, enregistrer la discussion, but you should be able to copy it, and then you'll have all those links there.
Yeah, and I've put in the chat box as well. If you, so there's a little right click moment. I've put in the chat box a link to our past and ongoing Webalog series, where doing all of this linking in the chat box is something we've done pretty vibrantly, and it's a pretty amazing. We've run those Webalogs for 8 years now, and so there's an incredible resource of really neat sessions there if you scroll down to little things of interest, and they tend to be, they're very conversational and interactive. They're kind of like multi-directional video podcasts or something, but anyway, it's a great resource, and we're looking forward to cross-linking these resources onto the new COPE, the updated site. So with that, I'm just going to offer a very sincere thank you to all of you for coming, but particularly a thanks to Jena, who enables our community of practice to thrive through her vision and direction and leadership, and also that sense of team effort that this kind of thing reflects. So we're so thankful, and I love the fact that we've had some random drop-ins that feels like it's just the right moment. So thanks for joining us, Julie, and also to Joanna, and feel free to keep up the conversation. We really appreciate you being here.
And thank you to you, Margot, for co-hosting with me, and Bob and Maya and Joanne, who are COPE Canada members, for being there, and all the rest of you for taking interest in the connections between health, environment, and society. So let's keep the conversation going.
And now, Jena, you'll get to be able to stop the video. That's always the thing to remember.
Suspend, arrêter.